Welcome, everyone. I'm Amy Seeley, president of Seeley Test Pros and Leap, helping students to succeed in all kinds of tests from 8th grade to grad school throughout Ohio.
And I'm Mike Bergen, president of Chariot Learning, helping students with test, school, and life based out of Rochester, New York.
Between the two of us today, we have over 60 years of experience at the highest levels of the test preparation and supplemental education industries.
We both love to talk and learn about the latest issues in education, testing, and admissions. So let's get down to tests and the rest. The fascinating topic we want to explore today is, does it matter if you take calculus in high school? But first, let's meet our special guest, Adam Tyner.
Adam Tyner is the National Director of Research at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Prior to joining Fordham, he served as Senior Education Analyst at Hanover Research, where he executed data analysis projects and worked with school districts and other education stakeholders to design custom studies. His work has appeared and been cited in The Economist, The New York Times, Forbes, Education Week, Education Next, and The Diplomat. Adam holds a PhD in political science from the University of California, San Diego. He also holds a Bachelor of Arts in International Studies from the University of Oklahoma. Welcome.
Yeah, great to be back with y'all.
Adam, it is great to have you back on the show, especially because you always bring such interesting topics to us. You first appeared on Test and the Rest in episode 140 to discuss social studies instruction and reading comprehension. You may remember that. And then in episode 295, to ask the question, would eliminating tests make education more equitable? Today, we're tackling an entirely different topic, but still in the world of education. Before we dive into the discussion of calculus and its relevance today, we'd love to hear what you've been up to. Can you tell listeners a bit about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, I'm the National Research Director at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan education policy think tank based out of Washington, D.C. And, as your kind of description of the episodes I've been on kind of alludes to, we do research on a lot of different topics related to K-12 education policy. We just work on K-12, but we really work on a lot of topics of interest to K-12 education policy reformers. We consider ourselves to be the kind of preeminent education reform think tank in America. And so we work on lots of different questions, large and small, sometimes big structural things, sometimes little questions about how we can make certain types of programs or certain types of policies or interventions work better. And so, yeah, I mean, over the last couple of years, we've continued to crank out reports. Your listeners can find us at fordhaminstitute.org, where all of our reports are posted publicly, all of our commentary blogs. We have our own podcast and everything. Can follow us there and see all the types of work we're doing. But yeah, we haven't slowed down since that last time.
Love that. Amy, have you been on the Fordham podcast yet? Because I don't think I've been on the Fordham Institute podcast.
Me? No, I've not been on.
We need to get you on
invited.
there,
yeah, exactly. Well, actually, I want to comment, Adam. It's the episodes you've been on with us and certainly your work are all of these really interesting topics that I know, like, at least for me personally, they're really great questions about education, like really sort of giving some real serious thought. So it's interesting to me that, like, you come up with the questions that I'm like, oh yeah, I would love to know the answer to that. So where do you guys kind of get, like, when you have a question, like, who gets like priority and what you get to investigate or research?
Well, education reform is something, unfortunately, I think a lot of people are not as interested in as they used to be. But the problems that we have in the public school system have really not gotten better in recent years since the pandemic. A lot of those problems have gotten worse, and student achievement is, been falling, and a lot of other measures of engagement, and we see chronic absenteeism. There's just a lot of problems in our public school system, and we are not giving up on trying to make it better. And so the truth is that with a gigantic system like our K-12 education system, there's a lot of different levers. And so there's a lot of different policies. There's a few national policies, but mostly we're focused on state and local policies. That's where most of the action is. And we just try to constantly be thinking up, what can we do that would provide new information that would help to shape the debates that are happening in districts and in states around the country, to help make schools focused on student achievement, helping to close gaps, helping to raise the bar for all students. And that's just what we've been doing since our inception. And although it's maybe gone a little out of fashion in the last few years, we're not giving up on it.
Well, we certainly love it. And what's interesting about our topic today is that it's not about a learning gap at all. It's not about we're all on the beat of post-pandemic learning loss and issues like that. But you were part of a team that released a really powerful, insightful look into calculus or statistics doesn't matter. And that means we're exploring the upper range of K-12 math rigor. And that definitely speaks to the decisions that many of our listeners, their teens, the students that they work with, have to make. Let's set the table with just the whole choice. Not every student takes statistics or calculus in high school. So, what are the typical pathways for showing rigor in secondary education?
Yeah, you're right. It's what I learned over the last few years is I was trying to learn more about secondary math pathways in general. There was just, when I say secondary, I mean middle school and high school math pathways. There just seemed to be so much action there. There was, concerns about equity. There were concerns about rigor in some of the classes, some of the course taking patterns. There were places that were, keeping students from studying algebra until certain grades, and also questions about updating our math curriculum to be more modern, to engage. We got a world awash in data. And so how do should students be getting into that data and learning about how to analyze it and taking data science courses or statistics courses, learning probability? How does that, fit in with the secondary math pathways that we've had traditionally? And what I learned, or one of the things that I learned kind of early on, was that calculus has this kind of strange place in our secondary math environment, in that it's kind of like the tail that wags the dog, because only
Yes.
about 10 to 20% of students will take calculus in high school. Yet a large proportion of students will take courses that are purportedly preparing them for calculus. They're kind of a calculus pathway. The most obvious one of those is the course called pre-calculus that many students take.
Right.
Just
Which, of course, there's now an AP version of pre-calculus, right? Which is
Yeah,
new.
and that's another kind of interesting factor, that like even going back to algebra 2, there's some things in there that were really developed because we wanted more kids on that calculus pathway. I mean, algebra 2 became kind of universally considered a high school graduation requirement for the first time in the 1950s after Sputnik, and had this geopolitical, like we're losing to the Soviets, and we've got to get more students on track for STEM. And so that was when algebra 2 became this kind of the default next course in high school math. But we've got all this work going up to calculus, and yet not that many students really take calculus. It's only 10 to 20% in high school. It's about 11% in our Texas sample that we use data from high schoolers in Texas, the high school graduating classes of 2003 to 2020. Nationally, I think it's slightly higher than that, but it's still less than 20% of students. And yet we're taking all these courses that are kind of leading up to that. And so it's this question, like, why does calculus have this place, and does it deserve it? And so that was part of what we were trying to do in this project, was just putting calculus to the test. Is it really all it's cracked up to be? Is it going to change your life trajectory if you take calculus? Or is it something kind of like a signal of high academic ability that's maybe matters to some stakeholders, but isn't really, because we think calculus facts and calculus knowledge is so essential to people's well-being later as adults?
Yeah, you summarize the history and the current state of the way we look at the math pathways in K-12 education, and especially as you were describing this how everything seems to lead up to calculus. It called to mind all the anxiety in families when their students are not tracked early enough to be ready, right? If you don't accelerate once or twice and jump the track, then you'll never be able to take calculus in high school. And for a lot of families, that feels like an existential crisis.
Yeah, and the problem with that is every school or system or district may or may not have a pathway for that, right? Like we have some schools in Cleveland, or most schools in Cleveland, that if you, with what you enroll in freshman year, you've already determined where that path would end for the most part. So you almost have to know at the front end, unless a school has some different sort of creative curriculum options that can then bridge that gap later on. If you decide, oh, I'm going to pursue STEM and I want that calc on my transcript before I
Yeah,
leave.
or if you're really ambitious and double up for a year and take two.
Lots of people, right? Double up or take a
Hmm.
summer class.
Well, we have schools, we have a couple of schools with block schedule. Those
Hmm.
kids have the pathway because if they take, in a year, if they take two maths, they can catch, quote unquote, catch up, right? But there are some places where families don't know that they're like limited from the get, right out of the gate.
So in this process, another contender as a way to show math rigor has emerged, and that is statistics, specifically on the AP track. AP statistics. That is an alternative, but a lot of people don't know where that stands in relation. So I guess we'll just go right to the heart of this, Adam. Does the choice between calculus and statistics matter?
It does matter. The question about calculus and statistics is really born as much from a methodological need to have somebody to compare those AP calculus students to that would be a fair comparison. Because depending on what course you terminate high school math with, if you finish high school math with your highest course was Algebra 2, the students who do that are just completely different than the calculus students. Now we've got Texas data that we were analyzing. We have student level data. It's over 5 million students, and we know these students' educational trajectories before and after they take calculus or statistics or other courses. And so we're able to use a lot of controls that really help us to make a lot more of a fair comparison and really evaluate to the extent that's possible the effect of taking AP calculus. But we wanted to compare it against something where the student wasn't. I mean, what's the alternative case, right? A student who might take AP calculus, if we just compared them to somebody who took a different class, in a lot of ways that might not be very fair, but the AP statistics students are normally kind of on the same track, I should say, where they've taken similar courses. Now we control for all of that stuff, but we also narrowed some of our focus so that we're just comparing those students. And so you asked, does it matter? And I said it does. And it really matters if you're a STEM student, because we see very different outcomes for the students who are for students going into STEM. So students who take calculus are much more likely to both major in STEM and get a degree in STEM in college than the AP statistics students are. So that's a big difference. Now, does it matter for other students? That is where it becomes a much murkier question. In terms of life outcomes and educational outcomes in general, it doesn't matter. Both of the courses are, we know they're both validated by AP, they're rigorous courses. And those courses they don't, whether you take one or the other doesn't make any difference in terms of whether you go to college, whether you complete college on time, or even your long-term earnings, which we're able to look at for a few cohorts of students. So for other students who aren't interested in STEM necessarily, it probably doesn't matter that much. And I think there's a bunch of other reasons you might consider taking statistics. But for STEM students, calculus is an important thing. And I'd add one more thing, Mike, about whether it matters. There's this thing that I alluded to earlier about the role that calculus has is this kind of like, is it a signal of elite ability? And that signal, I think a lot of college admissions officers have taken to heart that calculus is a hard class. Calculus signals that you were ahead in math to some extent at some point. And so if you take calculus, I think we hear lots of anecdotes about this, and the survey data that we've seen, not as part of our study, but in other studies, has shown that admissions officers, especially at elite institutions, do see that. But what I'm kind of hoping is that some of them will read our report and we'll find out that for non-STEM students, the outcomes are equivalent. And so maybe calculus doesn't deserve to be quite so important. When you look at all these other factors, it's really a wash. And maybe in the future it won't. For kids now, I think the answer is that, yeah, it does matter if you're aiming for an elite institution.
I'm glad you pointed that out, right? Because I think that you make really strong points about the fact that calculus might not be necessary depending on what a student plans to study. But a lot of these selective and ultra selective schools seem to still place this unreasonable weight or value on calculus.
I think that's right. I mean, I think that, over the years, we've had other kinds of study that served a similar role, like, studying Latin used to be this thing, like you had to, get Latin and then that could get you into one of these prestigious places. I don't believe that it was because people thought that Latin was really important to your chances as a good citizen or a productive worker or anything. It was just because it was this signal of elite
Yeah.
cultivation or high intelligence or whatever. It was probably more of a classist thing than it was about really just your IQ or something at that time. I think that the role of calculus is slightly different, in the sense that it's not just, only certain private schools that are offering it or something. It's pretty widely available. But I do think that it has become this shortcut that is not really justified, especially for students who are not STEM majors. Now, if you're the admissions officer for an engineering program, that would probably be a different, set of variables you'd need to weigh.
You just mentioned something that I think I've often thought of much more anecdotally, but I think is relevant in this conversation, which is you made the comment about taking Latin, right? One thing I've heard at a very large state university that I'm familiar with is, and I've heard this from an admissions reader, of them looking at foreign language, right? Foreign language signals something to them about, I think the conversation is not so much about particular classes sometimes, as much as the rigor that can be demonstrated by taking that class. So like we all know, a student who's going to put them up to the challenge of calculus is a different kind of student. A student who's taking like AP Latin, that's a different kind of student. Or even somebody who's taken 4 years of a language and is taking AP. So I think some of this has to do with these are students who very often are self-selecting. So in their very nature, they take on rigor, which is what would lead to their success, right? Or their ability to be a better qualifier for more selective admissions, right? I think that's part of it. But certainly there's a link here in the STEM field, right? If you take calculus, it's probably going to set you up way better if you're pursuing the STEM field in
there are
college.
different stakeholders in the system. They're getting different things out of our education system. But as citizens, a broader public, we want an education system that isn't just a fancy way of sorting students into the smart ones and the dumb ones or something. We want something that is actually cultivating knowledge and skills and abilities in the students. And then it has to be relevant knowledge, skills, and abilities. That's the kind of the justification for taxpayers spending so much money on public education, is that this is going to help our society, help our economy. And so the question then is, like, we don't just want people taking classes that are rigorous if the rigor is not leading to them actually being able to do something that's useful. And of course, calculus is useful to a lot of people, but it's also something that many other people don't use. And we live in a world where, knowledge of statistics is increasingly needed. I mean, we can just see it in, whether it's, you're reading a public opinion poll, or what you're reading an article in a newspaper that's referencing, just changes in proportions or other things. I mean, we see with sports gambling becoming such a big thing. If you have a sense of expected value and you've learned,
Take stats
you
to
can become a better gambler, or you could avoid gambling and understand
to understand
that walking into the
No, I'm
casino,
teasing.
your expected value is negative, right?
Right.
There's different ways it can be applied. Or you can become a great poker player, which some statisticians have done.
There's more statistics on the SAT and ACT than there is calculus, which is to say there's no calculus at all, but there are some stats for sure.
And I think that's what's interesting too, is because I think many majors these days in college might require a particular course in statistics. Now, back in my day, it was just plain old statistics, but I've seen that in college, kind of curriculum like choices. You could be, stats for business majors, stats for political science majors, stats for which is kind of interesting. That was, I have 5 kids, 4 of whom have graduated, from high school now. And the first 2 did take calculus. But my lesson learned from them was like they never needed it because they didn't pursue anything that was relevant. So by my third one, I said, look, I don't care if you take calc. And then he did eventually take stats in college. And the same thing for my fourth. Did not take calc in college, or in high school, but then is taking stats. So I think for a lot of kids, especially if you think you're a humanities kid, then you get into where stats would be probably more appropriate for you.
Yeah, I've poked around at the data a little bit on college major requirements, and I think that obviously there are some majors that require no math. There's some majors that require just like any math course. But of the ones that require either calculus or statistics, there's more that require statistics than requires calculus. That's of the institutions that I've looked at.
Is statistics as in AP statistics or?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We look at statistics through 2 different lenses in the report because we are looking at high schoolers. And so in high school, you could take an AP statistics course, which obviously has all the benefits of potentially getting college credit. And there's also just like regular statistics.
Yes.
It's just a high school statistics course that may be similar to what you'd get in an intro college class, or maybe a little slower and more introductory than that. So we look at both, but when we're doing the comparison between calculus and statistics, we focus just on the AP ones because those are the ones that are really the most apples to apples comparison there.
That makes sense. So, when you were clarifying the difference between, say, a standard statistics class and an AP statistics class, and earlier you used the word classist, and I guess it brings to mind the question, are there equity issues wrapped up in this question of statistics versus calculus at all?
So I think the best answer to that is to look at the data. And what we find in Texas during this period, first of all, we see a huge rise in just the proportion of students who are taking statistics. Statistics is on the rise. Both the non-AP version and the AP version are growing during that time. And in fact, during our study period, we see the calculus and statistic lines cross, where calculus used to be more common for high schoolers. Statistics is now more common than calculus in high school.
Well, I think my observation is more schools are actually offering AP stats. AP Calc has been around a very long time, but I think for me on my end, seeing the schools offering it, that's what's changed. There's more AP stats offering, than there was in the past.
It's really both, Amy. I mean, we see both. We look at both of that, of like what's the proportion of schools that are offering these courses, and just what proportion of students. But the students are outpacing the schools. Okay. The schools lines are flatter than the student lines. More students are taking these courses. There's more uptake and demand for those courses, even in the schools that were already offering them. But you're right. Both have gone up. It's more available than it used to be. AP statistics has been available, I believe, since the late 1990s. Yeah. And so we do see an increase over time, but it's not like, it's just, going from nothing to really high in the early 2000s, like you might.
But expect. Ironically, I will say this much, and I know this is anecdotal, but it's very interesting to me when I see a student go from Algebra 2 to stats, to AP stats, where they've made this decision to just forego the calc at all. And I will say in general, those students that I see make that leap tend to not be as strong in math. Like that is that is an observation. By opting out of calc, it almost always leaves with my little small data set somebody who is not really strong in math. That's been my observation for years.
Yeah, well, we can see some of that in the data. Now, if it's AP statistics, we control for prior course taking. So in our study, so it mostly is just students who took pre-calculus and then opted for AP stats instead of calculus. So that's another kind of wrinkle in what you're saying. But you can see that, and especially for the non-AP statistics courses, those students are not as high performing going in.
My guess is
they're like 8th grade.
They have to fill a 4th year math requirement typically. And so they're trying to figure out like what makes the most sense. So that's where you can see why they would do that, because as we're agreeing, understanding stats matters in many, many different career fields that you might pursue in college. Yeah.
Yeah. So I just want to get back to the equity question that Mike raised, because I was trying to kind of set the table for, just this rise of statistics. And I want to also talk about how that breaks down across student groups, because we see a rise in statistics taking and in any advanced math taking across student groups here. Every student group we look at by economic affluence, the more and less affluent families. We look at it by all the racial groups. We look at it by gender. Every group, more students are taking statistics than ever. But the rise is not equivalent in terms of percentage points or whatever. And so what that means is that although every group is rising, we see more Black and Hispanic and lower income. Those three groups are statistically less represented in advanced math course taking at the beginning and the end of our study. We see more of them taking statistics than ever before. But there's more white, Asian, and economically advantaged students. Those are the three groups that are statistically overrepresented among advanced math course takers. We see even more of them in the uptake of statistics. So what we see is both kind of all groups rising and also gaps widening. And so it's kind of a complicated story when it comes to equity.
Interesting. This feels like it's a more complex topic than we've been able to address, which is great that we've linked the source document, really involved document, in the show notes. But in parting, Adam, are there any major issues regarding this question of whether calculus even matters, or the difference between taking stats or calc in high school, that we should address?
Well, I think that there's a bunch of reforms happening in high school math, and we need to just be focused on making sure that every change that we make is promoting rigorous, validated coursework, that we're not promoting courses that are kind of empty shells that maybe are going to be rigorous in one school, but not rigorous in another. I mean, we can learn, I think, a lesson from what happened with California when they promoted a new data science course, which was supposed to make their math pathways more diverse, with more, this new kind of modernized, statistical content and using programming. But they didn't really develop their standards. And of course, there was no assessment. I know you guys like assessments. I do too. There was no end of course assessment. There was nothing to check and do the kind of transparency work to find out what the students were learning. And so the California Regents, they approved this as a substitute. The data science course is a substitute for Algebra 2, thinking that this was going to help kind of modernize have a new modern math pathway. And they ended up having to rescind that and take it back after a few years, because there were no standards, there was no assessment, no one really knew what was being taught in a lot of the places, and it became clear that they were putting students who weren't really going to succeed in Algebra 2 in that class instead, which means that probably a lot of the students were just getting even worse served by that course than they would have been by Algebra 2. So I think that one of the things that I've learned is that there's a place for statistics and data science and modern ways of doing math. I mean, real mathematicians use computers to do math, but we don't do a ton of that even in high schools. And there's ways to do that, but we also need to be really careful about the way that we do it and make sure that we're really upholding high standards, that those standards are developed, that everybody knows what we're really doing. And of course, I would love to just have a test that everybody in your state took at the end so we could find out which states, which districts did it well, which classrooms did it well, and have a common bar to measure things against. But that's one thing that I think is really important, that we have to make sure that these are all quality pathways.
That's fantastic. Adam, as always, we could speak with you all day. Unfortunately, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me again.
If listeners would like to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do that?
All of our content is available at fordhaminstitute.org. This report, other reports, we work on lots of topics in education policy, and we'd love for your listeners to check out our website. And if I'm easy to find with my emails on there too. Feel free to track me down and let me know what you think about our report.
Awesome. We hope you enjoyed this discussion as much as we did. Be sure to join us for another fascinating topic and guest on the next Tests and the Rest.
Did you enjoy this episode as much as we did? Find expanded links and more for this and all of our episodes at our show page at testsandtherest.com. While you're there, be sure to explore everything the larger TestBright site has to offer, including real, expert, unbiased answers to the toughest admissions testing questions. Of course, we'd love for you to rate, review, and subscribe to Test and the Rest on your favorite podcast platform. If there's a topic or guest you'd like us to feature, just let us know and spread the word.